Good afternoon, Holmes Road Church of Christ. What a beautiful white day to end our year pretty quickly. Tomorrow is the last day of the year, the last day of the year 2020. And on this occasion, as we celebrate the end of the year and New Year's and all that, I find that Psalm chapter 90 expresses much that is in my heart. Perhaps it'll speak to yours as well. If you want to get your Bible and turn to Psalm 90 and follow along as I do this devotional thought, that'd be great. The context of Psalm 90 is not a very happy one. In verse 8, the psalmist tells us that the psalm was written in a time when the people of God are consumed by God's anger. In verse 7 tells us that the people were overwhelmed by God's wrath. And why is God angry with them, you may ask? Well, why are the people consumed by God's anger? Why is God angry with them? Well, it tells us in verse 8, it's because of their own iniquities. Even knowing that this is the situation, knowing this is the thing that's going on here in Psalm 90, beneath the bad news of God's judgment and the fact that those people are having to deal with that, the actual underlying theme of the psalm in Psalm 90 is a bedrock of confidence in God's everlasting goodness. Even though these people in this psalm is having to undergo God's judgment because of their sin, the psalm is one that is actually very happy. We find in verses 14 through 17 that the people were rejoicing and anticipating the prosperity of the blessings that were to come once they go through God's judgment and His wrath. So understanding the setting and the context, the reason I wanted to use Psalm 90 when it comes to New Year's Eve and closing out one year and going to the next year is because of how the psalm reframes the way we think about time and its passing. It seems that whenever New Year's Eve rolls around, we got all of these lists, and you know, here's the best of 2020 or the worst of 2020, and then we start to look to the future. Here's what we can do in the future to make things great and all that kind of thing. And so as we look at time, that's why I think of Psalm 90. The psalm begins in verse 1 with good news. It says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations." No matter what year, no matter what time or generation you're a part of or era in time, God is the dwelling place. He's always there. It does not matter if you're in your 9th year of life or in your 90th year of life. God is the dwelling place. Verse 2, and moreover, verse 2 tells us that before the mountains were brought forth, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And this is a reminder that God exists outside of time. God is timeless. He does not celebrate a New Year's Eve. He doesn't celebrate a new year, or He doesn't celebrate a birthday or all these passings of time. He doesn't celebrate the passing of time. God views the expanse of time entirely differently than the way we see it. Verse 4 tells us that 1,000 years in our sight is like yesterday in God's sight. Framed by God's eternal existence, our time here on earth is really very short. Verse 10 says, "The days of our life are 70 years, or perhaps 80, if we are strong. Even their span is only toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away." The shortness of our life and the difficult times that are inevitably a part of any life, it can be discouraging. But verse 12 lets us know that it has a benefit. "So teach us to count our days, that we may gain a wise heart." Time is a great teacher. This verse tells us that as time passes, it can lead to wisdom. The phrase "count your blessings" in that verse, not blessings, that the phrase "count our days" in that verse, it means that we humans need to know and understand that our days are numbered. That knowledge and that awareness that our lives are actually very short and our time here on earth is a very short journey, it can actually help us become wise. The next obvious question is how? How does that realization, how does us understanding that our life is short, how does that help us in gaining wisdom? Well, to begin with, the brevity of our life contrasts with the eternity of God's life. When we count our days, we are reminded of our smallness compared to God's greatness. This recognition then leads us on the one hand, to want us to use well the time we're given to us. But on the other hand, it also reminds us of our utter dependence on God. Thus, the final verse of Psalm 90, verse 17, it reads, "Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and prosper for us the work of our hands. Oh, prosper the work of our hands." What a beautiful thought. When God's favor rests on us, when God prospers us, then our work will be fruitful. What a fascinating and relevant conclusion to the psalm. The psalmist's reflections on God's timelessness and his eternal nature, the relative shortness of our lives, and our dependence on God's grace all lead to a prayer that God may prosper our work. In this request, we hear an echo of the creation story in Genesis 1, in which God worked to create us in his image, so that we might work in this world as God's agents and co-laborers. Though our time here on earth is limited and it's short, our work still matters. It is important. What we do as workers will prosper as God's grace is active in our lives. Thus, as the year changes from 2020 to 2021, as we celebrate on New Year's Eve the changing of another year that has passed, as we remember the shortness of our own lives, we should not despair. We shouldn't be sad that life goes by quickly. Rather, we should be aware of our days. We should be aware that life is short. And we should renew our trust in the timelessness of God and ask His favor that we might make a difference through our work in the brief time we are allotted here on this earth. So enjoy New Year's Eve. Let Psalm 90 speak to you as we think about time passing. And I hope to see you soon, Holmes Road. We're going to be together very quickly. Our elders have decided we're going to meet very soon. If things stay hopefully things will not change for the worse. We know this is a fluid situation, but hopefully we'll get to see each other soon. God bless you. See you next year, Holmes Road.